The hall at the Twins was soaked in blood, the music of betrayal still echoing in the air. Robb Stark lay among the corpses, his vision blurring as the agony of betrayal coursed through his body. His mother, Catelyn, had screamed in rage before. Her throat was cut. Talisa, carrying his unborn child, had been butchered before his very eyes. The Freys had turned the sacred laws of hospitality into a twisted mockery, and the Boltons had driven the knives in deeper. But Robb Stark was not dead. He had felt the sword slide into his side, the cold bite of steel, the flood of warmth from his own blood. He had collapsed, the world tilting, but before he lost himself to the abyss, he heard the whisper of fate. The young wolf still has teeth. A hand pulled him from the pile of bodies in the dead of night. A girl no older than 15, her face smeared with soot and blood, her eyes filled with fear. A servant, one of many who had lived in terror under the Freys, who had seen what had been done to the Stark host. She had waited until the feast of slaughter ended, until the torches burned low and the Freys laughed themselves into a drunken sleep. Then she had dragged him away. Through the secret tunnels only the lowliest of the castle's rats knew. The fever took him for days. In the darkness of some forgotten cellar beneath the Twins, he lay on the edge of death, burning with pain and grief. The girl, Nysa, she called herself, nursed him, bringing stolen food, whispering of the Freys' cruelty, of the Boltons' treachery. When he awoke fully, the horror struck him anew. His mother was dead. His wife was dead. His bannermen, his people, slaughtered like animals. He wanted to die, but something deep inside him refused. The words of his father echoed in his mind. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies. But the pack survives. Robb was alone, but the North was still out there. The blood of the Starks still ran strong, and if he lived, then vengeance had to come. Weeks passed before he was strong enough to move. He hid among the small folk, pretending to be one of them, an outlaw escaping the chaos of war. Nysa stayed at his side, her loyalty unshaken. She had no love for the Freys, and in Robb she saw something greater, a chance to see the wolves rise again. He could not ride to Winterfell. Not yet. Boltons. Men would be waiting, eager to finish what they started. No, he needed something greater. He needed an army, and he knew exactly where to start. Deep in the Wolfswood, in the ruined castles of the North, the remnants of the Stark forces hid in the shadows. The men who had fled the slaughter, the ones who had refused to kneel to the Boltons, the ones who whispered of vengeance in the dark. Robb Stark rode into the night, his wounds still aching, his heart heavier than ever, but for the first time since the Red Wedding, his eyes burned with something other than grief. They burned with fury. Word of the young wolf's survival spread like wildfire among the Northmen. It was first a whisper, a ghost story told in hushed voices, but then outlaws and exiles began to vanish into the wilds, gathering at hidden camps, speaking of a coming storm. At first, the Freys and Boltons laughed. Then their men started disappearing. Heads were found on spikes outside their garrisons. Frey patrols were ambushed, their bodies left skinned and flayed, a message carved into their flesh. The North remembers. Robb struck like the direwolf he was named for. He did not have the numbers to fight the Boltons and Freys in open war, so he waged one of shadows and steel. The North was his battlefield, and he knew it better than anyone. He raided their supply lines, torched their camps, bled them dry. When he finally rode into White Harbor, his banners flying, the Manderleys welcomed him as a Stark reborn. "The king in the North rides again," they cried. House Mormont followed. House Serwyn, House Reed, the Umbers, half of whom had been forced to bend the knee to the Boltons, began to rise against their overlords. Even the Karstarks, divided as they were, could not ignore the truth. The rightful king in the North lived, and he had come for vengeance. Winterfell burned with the fires of war. The Boltons had dug in deep, knowing Robb would come. Rose ever. The calculating serpent thought himself ready. He had Ramsay, the Dreadfort's men, and the traitors who had bent the knee. But he did not have the heart of the North. The battle was not swift, nor was it easy. Robb fought with a rage that only the dead could know, his sword carving a bloody path through Bolton's forces. The ghosts of the Red Wedding screamed in his ears, and he let them guide his blade. When he finally stood over Roose Bolton, the usurper's cold eyes meeting his own, there was no mercy left in Robb's heart. "You betrayed the North," he said, voice raw with the weight of the dead. Roose Bolton did not beg, he only smirked. "You should have died that night, Stark. But no matter how many men you kill, how much blood you spill, you will never." Robb did not let him finish. He drove his sword through Bolton's throat and twisted. The war was not yet over. The Freys still ruled the twins. The Lannisters still held the south, but the north was his again, and Robb Stark was coming for the rest. The fires of battle still smouldered as Robb Stark stood in the great hall of Winterfell, the castle of his ancestors reclaimed, but not yet whole. The walls bore the scars of war, the banners of House Stark newly raised but stained with the blood of those who had fought to restore them. The North was his again, but the war was far from over. The gathered lords knelt before him, Manderly, Reed, Serwyn, the remaining Umbers who had turned against the Boltons. Even the Karstarks, hesitant at first, now bowed their heads, knowing their place belonged with the true king in the north. But the battle for Winterfell had not been without cost. Thousands had died, and the war to reclaim the north had weakened them. Robb's wounds still ached from the Red Wedding, scars both seen and unseen, but he could not afford to rest. As he stood at the high table, Ghost at his side, he looked upon his bannermen with steely resolve. "We have won the North," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "But our enemies still sit in their castles, believing we are too broken to fight. The Freys still hold the twins. The Lannisters still wear their false crowns. They think they have won." A murmur rippled through the gathered lords, voices filled with rage and bitterness. "They believe the North will kneel," Robb continued, his eyes dark with the weight of what had been done to them. "They think us weak, they think us scattered, but they forget one thing." Silence fell as he stepped forward, his voice a growl. "The North remembers." A roar erupted in the hall, fists slamming against tables, voices raised in fury. "The Freys must pay," shouted Great Jon Umber's son, his face red with the fire of vengeance. "The Lannisters sent their knives into our backs," cried Wyman Manderly, his fists clenched. Robb lifted a hand, and the hall quieted once more. He knew their rage, for it burned within him too. But anger alone would not win them the war. He had fought as a king before and lost. He would not make the same mistake again. "We cannot march south blindly. The Riverlands still bleed under the Freys and their Lannister masters. We will strike where they least expect." He turned his gaze to Howland Reed, the quiet and cunning Lord of Greywater Watch. "Lord Reed, I need your scouts. No one knows the swamps and rivers better than you." Howland Reed nodded, his sharp eyes unreadable. "We will find the cracks in their armor, Your Grace." Robb's jaw tightened. "The Freys broke the laws of gods and men. We will return the favor. I will not offer them the mercy they denied my family. We will take the twins, and we will tear their house down, stone by stone." The lords roared in approval, but Robb's mind was already moving ahead. The Freys were only the beginning. The Lannisters sat on their golden thrones in the south, believing themselves untouchable. He would remind them that a Stark's vengeance was not so easily forgotten. It took weeks to prepare. Robb did not march with a full army, for that would alert the Freys. Instead, he moved with small, deadly forces, men who could strike in the night, who could cut off supply lines and spread fear before the true assault began. The first fray. Garrisons fell in silence. Their men woke to find their commanders dead, throats slit in the dark. The banners of House Stark appeared on their walls like ghosts, a whisper of coming doom. Then the real war began. Robb struck the twins with the fury of the North itself. The Freys, bloated with arrogance and false security, had not expected an attack so soon. The bridges that had been their greatest strength became their greatest weakness. The Northmen, guided by Reed's men through the riverways, cut off their escape. The slaughter was merciless. Robb did not offer surrender. He did not take prisoners. He remembered how the Freys had grinned as they butchered his family. Now they screamed as the wolves tore them apart. When Robb finally entered the great hall of the twins, where his mother and wife had been murdered, he found the last of the Freys huddled like frightened rats. Walder Frey, old and trembling, tried to sneer. "You should have died, boy." Robb said nothing. He stepped forward, gripping the old man by his sagging throat, and drove his dagger into his chest. "You first," he whispered. The twins belonged to the Starks now. The Freys were no more. But there was still one enemy left. Robb Stark turned his gaze south, where the lions still ruled, and he rode for King's Landing. The Freys were no more. Their house, their name, their legacy, all reduced to corpses and ash. Robb Stark had fulfilled the first part of his vengeance, but his war was not yet done. The North was his again. The Riverlands had risen against the Lannisters, and now there was only one road left to take: King's Landing, the golden heart of the enemy, the seat of the lions who had orchestrated his downfall, who had sent the Boltons and Freys to betray him, and Robb Stark would bring them to ruin. The march south was not one of blind rage. He had made that mistake before. He had underestimated the cunning of the Lannisters, had believed in honor when his enemies had none. He would not make that mistake again. His forces moved in the shadows, striking at supply lines, burning Lannister camps in the night. He sent word to those who had suffered under the Lion's rule, lords in the Reach, in Dorne, even in the Crownlands. There were many who had lost fathers, brothers and sons to Tywin Lannister's wars, many who wished to see the Golden House fall. But Robb did not rely on whispers alone. He needed more than swords. He needed allies, and so he rode to Storms. And Stannis Baratheon sat in the great stone hall, his face as grim as the storm that raged outside. He had lost much: his fleet, his men, his brother Renly's support. He had been cast aside after his defeat at Blackwater, forced to lick his wounds while the Lannisters strengthened their grip. But he was still a king, and Robb Stark needed him. "You march on King's Landing," Stannis said, his voice like grinding stone. "You believe you can take the city?" Robb met his gaze without flinching. "Not alone, but together. We can." Stannis's jaw tightened. He was a man of pride, of unshakable will. To accept an alliance meant admitting he could not take the throne alone. But he was not blind. He saw the tides of war shifting, and he knew the North was no longer a lost cause. After a long silence, he spoke. "The North will bend the knee to me." Robb's hands curled into fists. He was a king, had been named so by his people, but he was not a fool. He could not rule the Seven Kingdoms, nor did he want to. He wanted vengeance, he wanted justice, he wanted the lions to burn. "The North will be free," Robb said. "When the Lannisters are dead, the Iron Throne is yours. But Winterfell will never." "Kneel again." Stannis studied him, his blue eyes sharp and calculating. Then he nodded. "Then we march." The combined forces of the North and Stormlands descended upon King's Landing like the storm itself. The Lannisters had not been prepared for such an attack. They had grown complacent in their victory, believing Robb dead, believing Stannis broken. Jaime Lannister rode out to meet them, leading the last of Tywin's forces. He fought with all the skill that had made him legendary, but he was only one man. The golden lions roared, but the wolves and stags drowned them in blood. Robb met Jaime. On the battlefield, sword to sword, the Kingslayer was fast, precise, but Robb fought with the fury of the North itself. He drove his blade through Jaime's side, watching as the Lannister fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "You killed my king," Robb said, his voice cold. "You thought you could kill the North." Jaime only laughed, bitter and broken. "We should have killed you when we had the chance." Robb drove his sword through the Kingslayer's heart. King's Landing fell within the week. The gates were broken, the city burned. Stannis took the Iron Throne, his grim face now crowned with victory, but Robb did not stay. He had no love for thrones, no desire for power. His war was over. The lions were dead. The North was free, and so the young wolf returned home, where the snow fell softly over Winterfell, and the ghosts of the past finally found their peace. The war was over. The banners of House Stark flew high once more over Winterfell, the direwolf's sigil standing proud against the icy winds of the north. Robb Stark had won back his home, avenged his family, and shattered the power of the Lannisters and Freys. But victory did not bring peace to his heart. The ghosts of the Red Wedding still haunted him. He saw them in the halls of Winterfell, in the faces of his men, in the blood-stained memories of his mother's final screams. Even with his enemies crushed, the weight of the past clung to him like a second skin, and there was still work to be done. Winter had come. With the fall of King's Landing, Stannis Baratheon had claimed the Iron Throne, his rule grim and unyielding. Robb had left him to his fate, refusing to play the game of kings any longer. He had secured the North's independence, forging a pact with Stannis that left Winterfell free from southern rule. But there was another war looming beyond the wall. The reports from Castle Black were grim. Jon Snow, his bastard brother, had sent word of the White Walkers, the dead marching beneath an endless winter. At first, Robb had struggled to believe it. His mind was still set on the war of men, on vengeance and betrayal. But the truth could not be ignored. The dead were real, and they were coming. Robb rode north with an army of his own making. The North had suffered, bled, and lost too much already. But this war was not about banners, crowns, or vengeance. It was about survival. He met Jon at the wall, his brother changed by hardship and duty. They embraced like the children they had once been, though they both knew they were no longer those boys playing in the godswood of Winterfell. "You've done the impossible, Robb," Jon said, his voice weary but proud. "You took back the North. You crushed the Freys and Lannisters. But this enemy, it's not like the ones we've fought before." Robb's expression hardened. "I've spent years fighting men. Now I'll fight the dead." The war against the Night King was unlike any before it. For the first time, enemies stood together. The North, the wildlings, the remnants of the knights. Watch, even the broken forces of the South, all of them faced the darkness together. Winterfell became the final battleground. The dead came in the night, a tide of ice and death that swept through the world like a frozen plague. The battle was endless, a nightmare of steel and screams. Giants tore through the walls, whites flooded the courtyards, and the cold stole the breath from living lungs. Robb fought at the front, his direwolf ghost at his side, cutting down the dead with the fury of every loss he had ever suffered. He did not fear death, he had already died once. And when the Night King himself came, stepping into the heart of Winterfell, the cold burning in his empty gaze, Robb did not kneel. He fought. Blade met ice, steel against darkness. The young wolf of the North, the last true Stark king, did not falter. But the Night King was beyond mortal strength, beyond the fury of vengeance. The cold crept into Robb's bones, freezing his limbs, his breath turning to mist. He fell to his knees as the dead surrounded him. And then, from the shadows, another blade struck true. Jon Snow's sword plunged into the Night King's back, shattering the icy monster into dust. The dead crumbled, the dawn broke, and Winterfell still stood. The war had ended, not just the war of men, but the war of the living. Itself, Robb Stark, scarred by war and loss, stood upon the walls of his home, watching as the snow began to thaw. The North had suffered, but it had survived. He had survived, and though the ghosts of the past would never truly leave him, he knew now that his war was done. He had avenged his family, he had freed his people, and now, at long last, he could finally rest. The young wolf had come home. Winterfell stood strong beneath the pale morning sun, the scars of battle carved into its walls, yet the heart of the North still beat within it. The war against the dead had been won, the long night shattered with the fall of the Night King. But the world did not simply move on from war. It carried its wounds, its ghosts, its lingering whispers of what had been lost. Robb Stark stood upon the battlements, his face hardened by years of suffering, his soul burdened with the weight of all he had done to reclaim his home. He had marched from Winterfell as a boy king, believing in honor and justice. He had returned as something else entirely, a man who had seen the price of vengeance. The North had bled for him, had suffered under the hands of the Boltons and Freys, had nearly been consumed by the dead. Now it needed to be rebuilt, and Robb Stark needed to decide what came next. The Lords of the North gathered once more in the great hall of Winterfell, their voices quieter than before, their faces etched with loss. The war had taken much from them, but it had also given them something: freedom. Winterfell belonged to the Starks once more. The North was no longer bound by the chains of southern rule, but there were those who wished to see Robb crowned once more. "You led us through war, Your Grace," declared Lord Manderley, his heavy voice echoing in the hall. "You reclaimed our home, avenged our dead, and saved the North from the long night. There is no other king but you." The lords murmured in agreement, their eyes turned to the young wolf. But Robb did not answer immediately. He only looked down at the sigil of his house, the direwolf stitched upon the banners that hung from the walls. King. Once the title had burned in his heart like a fire, filling him with pride, with purpose. But now it felt like another weight upon his shoulders. "I did not fight for a crown," Robb finally said, his voice even. "I fought for my home, for my family, for the people who placed their trust in me. I will not make the same mistakes again." A hush fell over the hall. "I will rule Winterfell as its lord, as my father did before me," Robb continued. "The North will remain free, but we have all seen what war does. We have all lost too much." His eyes met those of his bannermen, his words carrying the weight of truth. No more war. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, the lords knelt, not to a king, but to the man who had fought for them, to Robb Stark, Warden of the North. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Winterfell had suffered under the Boltons, and the scars of war were not easily erased. But the North was strong, its people unyielding. Jon Snow had left, choosing the path of exile beyond the Wall. Sansa ruled the Vale in his absence, while Arya had vanished into the world, seeking her own fate. Bran was something else entirely, something beyond Robb's understanding. He had chosen a different path, a different destiny. That left Robb alone to lead Winterfell, as it had always been his fate to do. The war was over. The dead were gone. The North was free, and yet as Robb Stark walked the halls of his home, he knew that he would never truly leave the battlefield behind. The ghosts of the Red Wedding would always whisper to him. The weight of vengeance, of the choices he had made, would never truly lift. But he had won. He had brought his people home, and that in the end was enough. Years passed, and Winterfell thrived under Robb Stark's rule. The North, once shattered by betrayal and war, had found peace at last. The scars remained on the castle walls in the hearts of its people and in Robb himself, but they did not define them. He had spent so long consumed by vengeance, by grief, by war. Now he ruled not as a conqueror, nor as a king, but as the Warden of the North, as his father had before him. The people no longer called him the Young Wolf. That name belonged to a boy who had marched south believing in honor and justice. The man who returned to Winterfell was something else, a survivor, a protector, a leader hardened by fire and loss. But peace, he had learned, was not the absence of war. It was the constant fight to maintain what had been won. The North had remained. Free after the war, untouched by the politics of the South, Stannis Baratheon ruled from the Iron Throne, his reign cold and unyielding. There was no love for him in the Reach, nor in the Westerlands, where the remnants of the Lannisters still nursed their wounds. But Stannis had honored his word. The North had been left to govern itself, its lands untouched by royal decree. The price of that independence, however, was isolation. Trade with the South had dwindled, and though the North could sustain itself, there were whispers among the lords. The world beyond the Wall had changed as well. The free folk, once seen as enemies, had been given lands to settle, a decision made by Jon Snow before he vanished into exile. Some northern lords resented it, unwilling to forget centuries of bloodshed. But Robb knew better than anyone what vengeance could cost. He allowed the free folk to remain, knowing that their survival was tied to the North's own. Still, old grudges did not fade easily. The threat did not come from the South, nor from beyond the Wall, but from within. One winter night, a message arrived from House Karstark, once loyal bannermen, then traitors, then allies again. A Karstark lord had been found dead, his throat slit in the dark. The whispers spread quickly: murder, revenge, justice. The dead man had been outspoken against. The free folk settling in the North. Robb knew what was coming before the next message even arrived. A village burned. A dozen free folk slaughtered in retaliation. The old hatreds were stirring again. Robb rode north personally, accompanied only by a handful of his most trusted men. His presence alone was enough to halt the bloodshed, but he knew it would not be the last time. He stood before both sides, Karstarks demanding justice, free folk refusing to kneel, and made his judgment clear. "There will be no war in the North," he said, his voice steady as steel. "Not while I rule." The Karstarks, bound by their oaths, grudgingly accepted his ruling. The free folk, wary but not foolish, stood down. But Robb knew peace could not be commanded. It had to be built. He stayed for weeks, settling disputes, speaking to both sides, ensuring that the fragile peace held. It was slow work, but necessary. He had fought too hard to let the North tear itself apart now. When he returned to Winterfell, the snow was falling, soft and silent. He stood in the godswood, beneath the ancient weirwood tree, the red leaves, whispering in the wind. He thought of his father, of the lessons he had taught him. A ruler who hides behind a castle wall is no ruler at all. Robb Stark had survived war, had reclaimed his home, had won his vengeance. But his greatest battle, the fight to hold the North together, had only just begun. And he would not fail. Not again. The years continued to pass, and Robb Stark remained the unchallenged ruler of the North. No crown sat upon his head, but none questioned his rule. The North was his, its people loyal, its lands rebuilding, its independence secured. Yet the weight of leadership never eased. Winterfell was alive again, its halls no longer empty, its courtyards filled with laughter and training swords clashing. The scars of the Bolton occupation remained, but they faded beneath the stonework. And the renewed strength of its people. The North had survived betrayal, war, and even the long night. But peace was never truly permanent. Robb had learned that lesson well. One evening, a raven arrived from the south. The seal was black wax, unmarked. The message was short, but it carried the stench of intrigue. "The lion still has claws." Robb read the words over and over, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. The Lannisters should have been finished. Cersei had been slain in the fall of King's Landing. Jaime had died by Robb's own hand. Tywin had been burned in the fires of war. But the words in this letter suggested otherwise. Someone, somewhere, still carried the banner of the Lions. Robb met with his closest advisers, Wyman Manderley, Great John Umber's son, and his most trusted war companion, Mage Mormont. He told them nothing of the letter at first, only asking about the state of the South. Stannis still rules, Manderley said, his voice steady but cautious. But his grip is brittle. The Reach still resents him. Dorne refuses to bend the knee. The Riverlands are too weary of war to rebel, but they do not love him. If there was ever a time for a Lannister to rise again, it would be now. Then we should strike before they do, Mage Mormont said, her bear-like growl full of readiness for another fight. Robb did not answer immediately. He had fought enough wars to know that striking blindly was what had cost him before. No, this time he would not be led into another trap. "We do nothing," he finally said, earning a surprised look from his council. Not yet. The next raven came a fortnight later. This time, the seal was crimson. It was signed with a name Robb had not expected to see again, Tyrek Lannister, a cousin to the main Lannister line, long thought dead in the riots of King's Landing years ago. But here he was, alive, writing to Robb Stark, of all people. "The Lions are not dead. The South is weaker than you think. Come see for yourself." Robb considered burning the letter. He had sworn never to march south again. The North was his only concern. The Game of Thrones had cost him everything before, his family, his men, his own life in a sense. But something gnawed at him. If the Lannisters were still a threat, even in the shadows, ignoring them would be a mistake. So Robb Stark made his decision. He would go to the south once more, not as a king, not as a conqueror, but as the wolf in the dark, hunting the last of the lions. Robb Stark rode south under the cover of night, cloaked in secrecy, accompanied only by a handful of his most trusted men. The North could not afford another war, but neither could it afford to ignore the whispers of the Lannisters rising from the ashes. His journey took him first to the Riverlands, where House Tully had once ruled before the Red Wedding had shattered them. Edmure Tully, once a prisoner of the Freys, had been restored to Riverrun, but he was no longer the proud man he had once been. He met Robb in private, his face worn with age and regret. "You should have let me rot," Edmure said bitterly. "The Riverlands have suffered enough. We won't fight for another cause, Robb, not again." "I'm not asking for a war," Robb replied. "I only want to know what you've heard." Edmure hesitated, then sighed. "There are rumors, gold moving through the lands, sellswords gathering in the shadows. A house that should have died still grasping for power. Tyrek Lannister?" Edmure's gaze darkened. "If it's truly him, then he's not working alone. The Lannisters had allies. Some of them never stopped scheming." Robb nodded. That much he had expected. The war had broken the Lannisters, but had not erased them. Greedy men still clung to their name, still dreamed of restoring their golden rule. He would make sure that never happened. Robb's journey led him farther south, to the outskirts of King's Landing, where the city still bore the marks of war. The people lived under Stannis Baratheon's cold rule, and though they no longer feared Joffrey's cruelty, they lived under heavy taxes, under a king they did not love. It was in the slums of Flea Bottom that Robb found the first true sign of the Lannisters' return. Gold exchanged hands in the dark. Men who should have been dead spoke in whispers, and there, standing at the center of it all, was the man who had summoned him, Tyrek Lannister. He was older now, his boyish features hardened by exile, but there was no mistaking the Lannister gold in his hair, the arrogance in his eyes. "I knew you'd come," Tyrek said, smiling. "Wolves are always drawn to the scent of blood." Robb studied him carefully. "If you wanted me dead, you would have sent assassins, not letters." Tyrek chuckled. "True, You've become too much of a legend to simply kill in the dark. No, I called you here because I have an offer. Robb's fingers itched for his sword. I don't make deals with lions. Tyrek tilted his head. Even when we have a common enemy? Robb narrowed his eyes. You expect me to believe you want Stannis gone? I don't care about Stannis, Tyrek admitted, but there are others who do, powerful men. And they don't want you as an enemy, Robb Stark. They want you as an ally. Robb took a step closer, voice low and deadly. You think I've forgotten what your family did? You think I'd ever fight for a Lannister? Tyrek didn't flinch. I think you're a man who cares about the North. And I think you know that war is coming, whether you want it or not. Robb stared at him, feeling the weight of his words. War was coming, and he had a choice to make. Robb Stark had spent years fighting wars, watching men die for banners, crowns, and vengeance. He had bled for the North, killed for it, and nearly died for it. And yet, here he stood again face to face with the ghost of an old enemy, listening to whispers of another war on the horizon. Tyrek Lannister's words lingered in his mind. War is coming, whether you want it or not. Robb had come to the south to end the last of the lions, to put a final stop to the Lannister name. Yet Tyrek did not come to him with swords drawn. He came with an offer, and that troubled Robb more than anything. He left the meeting with more questions than answers. If Tyrek spoke the truth, there were powerful men plotting in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But if the Lannisters were not leading this new conspiracy, then who was? Back in his hidden camp, his closest men waited for him. Maege Mormont, ever blunt, met him with a scowl. You should have killed him where he stood. We don't know what game he's playing yet, Robb replied. We know he's a Lannister, she shot back. That should be enough. It should have been, but Robb knew better than to fight blind. If war was coming, he needed to know where the first blow would land. Over the next week, Robb's scouts moved through King's Landing, listening to whispers. In the streets, watching the movements of men who spoke in hushed tones and exchanged gold in the dark. And what they found was troubling. The plots ran deeper than just Tyrek Lannister. The Reach was stirring, still bitter over Stannis Baratheon's rule. Dorne had not forgotten the deaths of Elia Martell and her children, nor the Lannister treachery that had stolen their kin. And in the shadows of the Westerlands, there were still men loyal to the Lannister name, waiting for a banner to rise again. It was not just one war brewing, it was many. On the 8th night, a rider came to Robb's camp, bearing a message with no sigil. The words were brief. Return to Winterfell. Trouble is coming. Robb's blood ran cold. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that the North was never truly safe. And if something threatened it now, he would not wait to find out what. He turned to his men, his decision made. We ride north. Tyrek Lannister and his conspiracies could wait. The North came first, always. And if another war was coming, Robb Stark would be ready.